Christians have argued over vaccines before. If you go all the way back to the 18th century, you can learn about really fierce debates between Christians about inoculation. Founders Ministries has a great article by Ben Purves. I think that's how you say his last name. Maybe it's Purves. On their website detailing the disagreements between Christians during the smallpox epidemic of 1791 in Boston. So Cotton Mathers, he, was a Christian who learned about the process of inoculation from his slave, Onesimus, and Mathers became a huge fan, a huge promoter of this method. He convinced a doctor in the area to start taking the blood of a sick person and putting it into a small cut of a not sick person. And then what happened was the mortality rate from smallpox among those who were inoculated went from 15% to 2%. So 15% of those who were not inoculated to 2% of those who were inoculated. But there were also people who died from that inoculation. And most famously, the fire and brimstone preacher, sinners in the hands of an angry God, Jonathan Edwards. Edwards was a big believer in inoculation. He got it for smallpox, and his daughter ended up dying because of it 30 years after Mathers and Onesimus developed and promoted the method. Even though people could die from the inoculation, though, Mather's father, Increase Mather, very interesting names, did a lot of PR for it from the beginning. So back when the smallpox was breaking out in Boston about 30 years before Jonathan Edwards died, there were people dying then, too, from the inoculation. But Increase Mathers argued that to not get inoculated is the same thing as breaking the biblical command to not murder. So this sounds really familiar. He argued that people who didn't get inoculated were followers of Satan. Take that, Big Eva. You guys are on the same side as the slaveholder when it comes to this vaccine stuff. That gets a little complicated. However, this article in Founders Ministries also notes, despite these tactics, it is surprising to note that Increase Mather did not want anyone to receive inoculation contrary to conscience, but instead for them to be persuaded to change their mind. So actually, even Increase Mathers and Cotton Mathers were a little bit more considerate and a little bit more logical when it came to this than some of the professing Christians are today when it comes to this. There were also pastors who argued that anyone getting the inoculation didn't trust God and were themselves not faithful Christians. The article says this, quote, "In reading multiple sermons and letters from this period, opposing sides of the inoculation debate would manipulate scripture to advocate for their positions, sometimes with both sides using the sixth commandment to argue their case. In contrast to these polar opposites were the voices that appealed to Romans 14 and viewed inoculation as an issue of the liberty of conscience." So the article includes this letter written by Pastor John Newton on June 3rd, 1777, quote, "It seems I must write something about the smallpox, but I know not well what. Having had it myself, I cannot judge how I would feel if I were actually exposed to it. I am not a professed advocate for inoculation, but if a person who fears the Lord should tell me, I think I can do it in faith, looking upon it as an expedient which God in his providence has discovered and which therefore appears my duty to have recourse to, so that my mind does not hesitate with respect to the lawfulness, nor am I anxious about the event, being satisfied that whether I live or die, I am in that path in which I can cheerfully expect this blessing. I do not know that I could offer a word by way of dissuasion." He goes on to say, "But if another person should say, my times are in the Lord's hands. I am now in health and am not willing to bring upon myself a disorder, the consequences of which I cannot possibly foresee." So they're saying, if something happens to me because of the vaccine, I don't want to take that risk. John Newton is saying that this person could go on to say, "If I am to have the smallpox, I believe he is the best judge of the season and manner in which I shall be visited," talking about God, "so as may be most for his glory and my own good. And therefore I choose to wait his appointment and not to rush upon even the possibility of danger without a call. If the very hairs of my head are numbered, I have no reason to fear that, supposing I receive the smallpox in a natural way, I shall have a single pimple more than he sees expedient. And why should I wish to have one less?" So they understood then, many, many years ago, hundreds of years ago, or at least John Newton understood that this is an area of Christian liberty. And of course, earlier when I was talking about some people being on the side of slaveholders, that was a joke, because a lot of people in Big Eva and the big evangelical complex actually discount all of the theology and all of the points by slaveholders from hundreds of years ago. I just think it's interesting that they're actually holding some of the same views on the sinfulness of not taking a vaccine as people that we know held slaves. Then I think that we should just all embrace the fact that history can be very complicated. But the point is that these arguments have been had. I personally think that John Newton nails it, that there are different ways to look at this. Now, the fetal cell line does add another complicated layer, but I have heard persuasive biblical arguments from people like Al Mohler, persuasive biblical arguments from people like John Piper about that particular issue. And so I do believe that this is an area of Christian liberty, and Christians should be so quick and so passionate about honoring that Christian liberty, and should be so slow to say, if you get the vaccine, it's because you hate babies and you're not really a Christian and you don't trust God. Or if you do get the if you don't get the vaccine, it's because you hate your neighbor and you're not loving. Look, there are risks that you take every day that may or may not put your neighbor at risk. You take that risk every time you get into the car, especially if you're someone who has ever texted and driven. Now, if you have texted and you have driven at the same time, does that mean that you are a hateful person who doesn't love your neighbor? Maybe you were being reckless at that time and you shouldn't have done it. But I mean, we all take risks every day, and most of us don't consider ourselves, hateful people who don't love our neighbor because of risks that we take. And especially when it comes to this, when there's a downside, there is a possible downside. There are side effects that come with this shot. They may be rare. Some people argue based on the VAERS database that they're not exactly rare. I've even heard doctors say that, but there are risks that people have to consider. And to say that you have to take this risk or else you're not a good Christian or else you can't feed your family, that's criminal to me. That's so wrong. And that's why I think that Christians should be the first people, as really the Reformed Christian tradition shows us, to be the first people to stand up for people's liberty. I mean, talking about loving your neighbor, why is it not loving your neighbor to stand up for their liberty, to not take a shot that they don't want to take, that maybe they don't even need? Why is that not a way to love your neighbor? I'm your neighbor. That's how you can love me. I'm your neighbor. You can love me by defending my liberty. I'm going to love other people by defending their liberty. I also don't want to get them sick. That's why I'm not going to be around people if I'm sick. And we can all make a decision about the vaccine if we want to take that, and we won't get into that all right now. But it is an area of Christian liberty. It should be an area of American liberty as well. It should be an area of civil liberty.